That's perfectly fine. As they say, flags fly forever. So
there you go.
You've got it.
Alrighty, let me play a little bit of the game here. I sent you a list earlier on of about 6 or 8 kind of big contracts. And what I'm thinking about is let's maybe walk down those contracts and describe what you think about those contracts, good contracts, bad contracts, what were the dynamics around them. What I basically did is I went through and I picked out contracts that are 6 years or on occasion 5 years that are active today, right? They were signed before this last season started. So let's just talk about the dynamics behind those contracts and see what we can learn from them. Sound fair?
Sounds good. Yeah.
Let's talk about Carl Winston, Charm Cities, $31 million man.
Carl Winston is, if not the premier power hitter in the league, then, right up there in that conversation. Right off the bat, there's an extremely popular player that can hit all the home runs that you could ever need. And, not only that, but he can play a non-first base or DH position. He's a pretty good third baseman as well. So you see he's got a lot to offer, but 31 million is a lot of money, and then you throw in that he's 33 right now and he's got 4 more years guaranteed or 3 more years guaranteed. So I don't know if it's a contract I would sign, but I wouldn't call it the worst contract that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I don't think it's the worst contract we're going to talk about. I think it is technically, and I'll use that term technically, a bad contract. The minute you sign it, it's a bad contract. That doesn't mean that it was unwise to do, in my mind. I think Charm City was in a little bit different position when they signed that contract than they are right now. I think they've crashed deeper than they thought they were going to crash. And the other point about that is it's 31 million now. It drops down to 18 before it's all said and done. So he's scaled that one a little bit. It's bad in the sense that, in my mind, when I start thinking about contracts, I start thinking about kind of rule of thumb. And I break this rule of thumb all the time, so don't hear me. hear what I say and watch what I do rather than pretend like I'm pontificating too much. But I think about WAR, and I think every team is going to, what is replacement level? Replacement level is, in my mind, 45 wins. And so what that says is that if I do nothing but hire replacement level players, I'm going to win 45 games. I want to win 95 games, and so I need, for my $110 million, I need to add 50 WAR. 45 wins to 95 wins is 50 WAR. So at $110 million for my payroll, I get to spend about $2.1 million per WAR. And so at $31 million, Carlton Winston needs to make 15 WAR, and that is not happening, right?
Yeah.
If that happens, then by all means, that was a beautiful contract. Right. So technically, for what the value is, Winston cannot possibly return that value. And I think ultimately, if Charm City had that to do over again, they probably would not sign that again. But who knows? It also doesn't help that he kind of had a ratings hit right afterwards. Let's talk about One Sweet World, Las Vegas, and Jaden Harsnett.
Sweet World and Harsnett, that's a couple of a couple pieces of a really good outfield. But then you also have to consider what their contracts are. Sweet World, it's a lot of money, but from my point of view, if you're going to pay a lot of money, then pay that kind of money to someone who plays center field and can hit. And Sweet World does that. So, if you look at the guaranteed portion of his contract, you almost might want to say, I wish that opt-out weren't there, because even with it, it's only taken him to his age 32 season. Mm-hmm. I really don't have any problem with that contract. I'd love to hear your thoughts for a second.
My thoughts are the two of them together. Harsnett and Sweet World. are $40 million that you've got tied up now in these two guys. And that worries me. I don't, if there was one or the other, I think that I would feel much happier. But one of my issues with big contracts, long-term contracts become bad contracts, can become bad contracts pretty quickly. And Sweet World actually smells to me like it may end up being a bad contract. My guess is that Matt actually would like that one back before it's all said and done. Mostly because, again, he's kind of taken a bit of a hit. He's not a guy who can take a walk. It's looking like he's still going to wind up putting up, 5 WAR, 6 WAR. So by definition, even at 6 WAR, he's got to make, per my rule of thumb, he's got to make $14 or $15 million. And so that's about $5 million over. I mean, if he turns out to be Sandcastle, then by definition, that's a fantastic deal. But I look at it at risk, and you've got, I like Harsenet better in that sense than I like Sweet World. But the two of them together means that I'm almost certainly going to have some problems before it's all said and done. One of those two is not going to work out for me, and that's a pretty big chunk of money to have tied up for 3, 4, 5 years. But admittedly, the good part of it is that there are some options out there that Matt can deal with. And the second piece of this that makes it an okay situation is, Matt Rechtenwald is like the king of all GMs. He will find a way to work his way out of anything that turns bad.
Yeah.
Right? Without any question. That is actually a skill set that a lot of people, I think, need to figure out how to deal with.
Absolutely agree with that. And I've found through my own mistakes and moves that, it's certainly possible to get yourself out from under one of those bad contracts. It's, ideally you don't get yourself in that situation, but
Jenkins.
Jenkins. I don't know what you're talking about. I think in the BBA there's no such thing as an untradeable contract, as long as the player has got something that they can offer to a team.
Yeah, and I think that's, maybe we'll jump into that just a little bit. I know we're going to talk about dealing with contracts when we get into finances a little bit, but you talked about that. There are groups of people who talk about a bad contract totally ruining an organization, right? And I think bad contracts certainly can ruin an organization if the general manager, within the Brewster and within the salary cap and our budget problems, when you sign a really bad contract or a contract that turns out to be bad, right? Nobody signs a bad contract to begin with.
Right.
But sometimes a contract turns out to be bad within a month of signing it, and sometimes it's takes a while, right? The point of the matter is that there's always a way to move that contract before it's all said and done. And not to try to enter into a controversy or whatnot, but there is one strong way of doing that. And when we talk about teams that have high budgets, there are like 8 teams in this league right now who have a budget at about $130 million or more, right? And since our salary cap is 110, by definition, all of those 8 teams are candidates for a lower level team with a super bad contract that is hampering their ability to grow. Those 8 teams are all candidates to essentially erase that contract, right? Because you can package up almost any semi-reasonable prospect and get out from under a $20 million contract, almost Absolutely. Get out of jail free card, right?
Yeah.
Because
no doubt.
For you, I think you're at about if I remember right, you're at $132 million as your budget. Depending on whether you spent a lot of money on IFAs this year, you've probably got a big cash glut that you're going to have to give back for nothing, right?
Yes.
And so the whole point that I loved your comment about there's almost no contract that is untradeable here as long as a general manager is proactive.
Yeah, it's just a matter of putting in the legwork.
John Mick. Talk to me about John Mick's contract.
John Mick definitely makes a lot less sense to me than Winston. They're kind of comparable players. I think Winston is better. And, Mick, he's stuck at first base or DH. And I don't think the availability of cheap DH first base types is quite where it was about 10 years ago in the game, but it's still not a position where you absolutely need to spend that kind of money.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing to me about John Mick, and obviously he's in my division. It's a contract that Chris Wilson signed with him. John Mick is, I think Chris saw him as the kind of face of the franchise, big name player he wanted to keep for his fans. The money is a little bit high for a 31-year-old. He's not going to make his 9 WAR that he needs. It's an $18 million contract. What is the most interesting thing to me about this is that it's backloaded for a 31-year-old guy. Unlike, say, Harsnitz, that goes from 19 million to 16 million, or Winston's that goes from 31 to 18 over the years. Chris decided to backload this one. It goes from 18 up to 20. And so that's a 6-year contract. And so he's going to be 37 years old, making $20 million. Although, if I remember right, that last year is actually either a vesting or a team option. I don't remember. I didn't write that down. But I thought that was an interesting contract specifically because it backloads a little bit, which is unusual for 6-year contracts.
Yeah, it's definitely unusual, and you have to imagine that Chris has got some idea of where his payroll is going to be in 4 to 6 years, mm-hmm. And it must have made some sort of sense at the time that he signed it.
There you go. And Chris is also not at this stage one of those teams that has the big payroll, or a big budget. So that's adds a little bit of a risk factor to him. I loved seeing him sign John Mick because I love the idea of this commitment of the franchise to a player. The fictional aspect of it feels good to me. I admit the pragmatic side of me loved him signing it because that means one of my division mates is spending $18 million on a risk. Now, that having been said, John Mick is a quality hitter, and if he keeps hitting well through 35, 36, I mean, that's not a horrible thing, but it's a risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of risks, talk to me about Mario Balderas.
Oh, this one makes no sense to me. I tried to wrap my mind around it, but there's just not much here that I see that I like. The age, first of all, really stands out. 34 years old, got 2 more years guaranteed, and then that's a player opt-out. And then after the player opt-out, you have a guaranteed year and then 2 player options. So, you could be on the hook for this $12.5 million, as Mario Balderas approaches 40 years old. And now he looks like he can still hit, but at 34, not everybody can be Leon Sandcastle. So I'd say we're in trouble a little bit here.
Yeah. One of my takes on Mario Balderas is that this is a contract that was signed by one of the best general managers in the league, a 34-year-old player for $12.5 million for 6 years. And so it makes me step back and think, what does Alan know that I don't, right? And as I think about it, actually there's an interesting strategy. I'm going to be interested to see if Alan can comment on the thread when we post this, because here's my frame of reference on why I think this deal works for him. Brooklyn is all in this year and is clearly going to have troubles in the following years, right? Alan is already writing the ultimate rebuild threads.
Yes.
Balderas is 34 years old. $12.5 million is not a horrific number. It only takes up a certain chunk of that $110 million salary cap. My guess is that he doesn't care whether he loses a whole lot of money over the next couple of years with Mario. And the possible pressure valve here is that, Balderas gets to be 38 and he's not hitting. Maybe Balderas will retire rather than take the extra $12 million a year. At the end of the day, if you're talking about, I want this guy to hit this year and my rebuild is going to take me at least 3 seasons, then you're really only talking about risk in seasons 5 and 6. or if your rebuild is going to take 4 seasons and you're really only talking about a risk in year 6. So at the end of the day, the unique situation that Brooklyn is in may actually make this contract work. But as a general rule, you sit back and you scratch your head and you go, why would you possibly give $12.5 million to a 34-year-old outfielder? But yes, maybe he'll age like Sandcastle. And
maybe he will. And I'd certainly, can see the point of, having him through this rebuild as someone who's very popular and might keep putting some butts in the seats, and maybe the consequences aren't as severe when you're going to be in a rebuild.
Right. When you already know that your next 3 years are going to be, you're not trying to tank, but you're not going to win a lot. Right. Balderas is a guy who's actually you can argue that you're not tanking because you're carrying Mario Balderas.
There you go.
So. Give me your point of view on Jose Chavez, my $12 million to $11 million 6-year contract with a vesting option at the end.
Chavez is a great pitcher, but like with Balderas, he's pretty old for me to be handing out that kind of money. And obviously, as you've said, Yellow Springs is one of those teams with the budget over the salary cap. But given the number of young contributors on Yellow Springs that are approaching free agency, the deal for Jose Chavez is a little bit of a head scratcher for me.
It's actually a head scratcher for a lot of guys, and for me, it was a no-brainer. At the time that I signed Chavez to that contract, he was making, I think, $16 million the year before. So this was a drop in his salary. And like I've said before, as long as he maintains his ratings for this year and at least holds on to them a little bit for next, then I have almost no risk. And that is because if I need to, I can cut him because of that budget. My budget is $144 million, and it will probably be more next year before that's all said and done. My intention is to spend some money on IFAs next year. So if I have to cut him next year in order to save his salary, then I actually hurt my IFAs. But if he crashes and burns within 2 years, the situation that I am in is I can cut him with absolutely zero impact, right? Because I've got a $144 million budget and our salary cap is 110. I mean, if he crashes and burns and I have to cut him, then
you would be able to take it. And I think even if you did want to get rid of him, as long as he doesn't completely crash, there was probably somebody willing to take him in his contract to add to their rotation.
Yeah. At $11 million once he gets past the next year. My first line of defense would be to try to trade him to somebody who's a rebuilding team who needs a semi-reasonably priced guy who can draw fans, right?
Right.
And so Chavez would do that. But I'm saying it's a zero risk problem for me. If I were Yellow Springs when I took over the team, it would be a problem because I could not cut him with a $90 million budget,
right?
And still be able to build. And this is an important thing to understand. You have to manage your team in a salary cap league. You are allowed to manage your team differently if your budget is over the salary cap than if it is under the salary cap.
Exactly. And that's kind of just one of the really big takeaways for someone, as a reminder, build up your budget and do what you can to get up and over that cap.
Right. And so this question of when is a contract a good contract or a bad contract? If I signed Jose Chavez at 33 years old to this contract in 2007 when I was coming up, that would be a horrible contract because if it crashes and burns, which is about a 50-50 chance it's going to crash and burn sometime, then I would be stuck. Who was it? Was it Gary? The Montreal guy, was talking on the forum about how it's different to run a team that's established versus a team that's coming up the pike. And the purpose of these conversations is to talk about how the BBA is different and so forth. I'm just saying that if I had made that contract early, then I'd be in trouble. But since I did it last year, and my team is in a totally different situation, I don't consider that to have any risk whatsoever. It was a freebie for me, right?
Certainly.
But a lot of other people look at that and go, and in fact, I think it was Fred, the Mexico City GM, was casting doubt upon me at one point, which I thought, okay, that's fair. Anyway, Egbert Biener, Jacksonville.
This is a
$10 million, 6 years.
Yeah, it's really he's kind of been I don't know, maybe a little bit of an up and down kind of pitcher, but for the most part, someone that anybody would like in their rotation. And for $10 million a year of almost whatever the length, obviously we have the maximum of 6 years in the BBA. So if you're gonna tell me that hey, here's a pitcher that's gonna be at least a middle of the rotation type, 6 years, 60 million, would you take it? 9 out of 10 times I'm going to take that. So I got to say, I do like this contract.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant contract. I think it had to fall into Tyler's lap. The OOTP gods occasionally give you this kind of opportunity. He's a solid 2, a good 1, or an occasional 1. You're talking about how he varies, right? $10 million for a guy who can throw down a ace year is in this league is fantastic.
Right? Absolutely, yeah, it's a deal. Especially, it's good to say in this league, because in this league, those top starter types are the guys that really get overpaid.
Yeah, I mean, the top starters are probably worth $16, $17 million, and sometimes in the right or wrong, depending on your point of view, free agent dynamic. It'll, obviously Eduardo Lopez and Correa got $30 million apiece. So,
yeah.
And speaking of big numbers, let's talk about Ken Jenkins for a minute. I know we're breaking the rule because this isn't a last year deal, but $24 million per 6 years. It was front loaded a little bit, if I remember right. Lots of player opt outs and team options. What was the thinking?
At the time, he was a somewhat passable center fielder, and Long Beach really had a need for a center fielder, and he was 28, maybe no more than 29. Sorry, my wife just got home. Dogs are excited, so I'll have to go in just a minute. He met a need for Long Beach, and I had the salary cap space at the time, and that was the decision. It was, as you are saying, it was an overpay from the beginning, but I feel like in this league, sometimes you have to overpay for the guy that you want and may need.
I wanted to hear you talk about it a little bit, because I think that's an important thing for a person, especially a person who's new into the league, but sometimes even folks who have been in the league for a while and are still anxious about throwing down big dollars, right? What I just heard you say is you had a plan, you had a need, you had a window of opportunity, and you decided to go for it.
Yes.
And so I think at the end of the day, we're going to probably hear this in this series of conversations that we have. If you have a plan, go for the plan. And sometimes that means you have to take a risk. But going back into that conversation where we were talking about, where you brought up that there is no contract that cannot be gotten out of, Jenkins is like exhibit A for how to create a good/bad contract and get out of it.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, he's the reason why I say there's no such thing as an untradeable contract in the league.
And my belief on the matter is, and tell me if I am wrong, because I made a comment earlier that there is no such thing as a bad contract when you first sign it. My belief is you knew that was probably a bad contract when you first got into it, but you didn't care.
Yeah, that's accurate. And I knew that it was going to end up bad, but I didn't know that it was going to go so bad so quick.
There you go. Let me swap over and talk about what I think is a fantastic example of a great use of front loading, and that is Claudio DeFazio that Ted signed with California. $23 million for year one of his extension, and then it drops to $10 million a year for the rest of his, a 6-year deal all total. The second example of an interesting contract, 6 years with very low risk, is Atlantic City's Jared Wilson. I completely missed him signing this 27-year-old pitcher for 6 years at $1.1 million per, with a couple team options at the end. I don't know if you have had a chance to look at those two contracts, but I'd be interested in your point of view as to whether you share my great enthusiasm for them.
I do share the enthusiasm, and the Claudio DeFazio in particular is rather infuriating as someone who is competing with California year in and year out. It's just a really good move. You know, you look at a guy who's 27, who plays good defense, really good defense, you know, who hits righties, to lock him up for 6 years and essentially 10 million per. You know, you can almost ignore that $23 million a year, because it's, you know, it's obviously going to be under the cap for Ted, and he's, you know, I think he's one of those teams that's over the, you know, budget over the cap, and just that's the kind of deal that everyone should strive to make when they have the opportunity. Jared Wilson, this one really flew under the radar for me. He's not my type of pitcher with that low movement, but when you look at a guy who can start or relieve, looks like he's mostly been in relief the past couple of years, but he's at least got that ability to slot into the back end of your rotation. Excellent control, and really the only thing you have to say about it is that it's $1.1 million a year for a 27-year-old. That any team can get out of that contract whenever they want, and he doesn't have to do a whole lot to be worth a lot more than that money.
Yeah, I thought as soon as I saw it, I thought, wow, that is a brilliant contract, because it is almost zero risk. You're talking about $1 million essentially, which is almost meaningless in the context of our league. And you know, the upside of this is huge before it's all said and done, because all he needs is 1 or 2 decent years, you know, better than decent years to make this pay off at the end of the day. And in worst cases, you've got a guy who's a little bit above replacement level who can throw in relief for 6 years, and you just fill that slot, right? So yeah, I mean, he's not one of those guys that most people would look at and say, here is an impact player, right? It's not the usual player that you'd see getting a 6-year contract, but I just love this contract.
Yeah, no, you're saying everything that I'm thinking.
Right. And DeFazio, oh my God, $23 million once, and then $10 million for a guy who's essentially a superstar. Kudos to Ted on that. I think that's a brilliantly structured contract for our league. That's a contract you would never see in the MLB, right?
No.
Which is one of the things when Ted and I were talking on the forum about our BBA economy. Our BBA economy is different, and so that's one of the key things to think about for a new person coming into our league is it takes a solid season to understand our economy. And ask questions, right? Ask me, ask any of the people who have been around, ask 5 of us and get different answers. Yeah. Right. I think that's one of the great things. Let me close this segment off I want to talk about New Orleans and Ronaldo Boxcar Ruiz under the concept of why is it so hard for a team to let a guy go to free agency?
There's a lot of reasons where it is difficult to let someone go to free agency. You know, I fall into this trap a lot as well. Mm-hmm. You know, even when I let someone go to free agency, I tend to get right back into the free agent pool and find a way to get him back.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you've got the emotional attachment, and I think that stems from writing about these guys and familiarity, status quo. In some cases, maybe it's a fan interest. You don't want to take the fan interest hit, for losing a guy. But in the case of Reynaldo Ruiz here, it's really doesn't quite make sense to me. Yeah, he looks like he's a great utility player. But he reminds me a lot of Brooke Becker, who was an EBA import that played a lot more innings in Long Beach than anybody ever expected him to. But he never cost nearly $5 million a year, and he never got 5 years guaranteed at a time like Ruiz did here. I think Ruiz is the kind of guy that if you want to keep him on your team, that's great. But you go year to year, and you should be able to get him for $2-3 million a year, and there's really no reason to throw that kind of guaranteed money at him.
Yeah. Obviously I'm picking out some specific contracts so we can talk about unique situations around them. And this is one that I looked at, and I'm very interested to hear if Jim listens to us and will comment on it as we go through. But yes, 5 years at 4.7 per for, a perfectly good little shortstop. Reynaldo Ruiz is a shortstop, and so by definition, that's a position of some scarcity. But he was a fantastic shortstop 5 years ago, and he was not, he's not so fantastic at this stage.
Right.
He's just a kind of, don't have him up on my screen right now, but my note here was, I'm at a loss as to why you give this kind of deal to a one WAR player. Because again, my frame of reference is $2.1 million for a WAR. And we'll talk about that rule of thumb a couple of times in our series, because there's lots of reasons to break it. I do wonder whether maybe there's a fan interest thing there, or whether Jim is just, he loves his player. I don't know. I've done that. I give people contracts to players that I love. I get that. But from the outside looking in, there's, from a pure point of view on this contract, to me, unlike the Jared Wilson side, which is all upside, there's almost no downside. To me, there's almost no upside on this. I don't see Ruiz ever being worth more than $4.7 million, and probably worth less than that. So my question from a generic conversation in how I would run this team within the BBA, how I would look at this player if he were on my team, is I would let him go to free agency. And then if I want him back, try to sign him back for, like you said, year to year, or if I need to give him 3 years for $3 million, or I did that with Carlos Garcia. I did not want to spend the $8 million or $10 million he wanted to extend him. And so I sent him back through free agency and signed him for a 1 year deal at $7 million, $6.8 million, something like that, with a team option. And I would like to be more cold-hearted like that more often. I would like to send my guys back to free agency more often, and I may end up doing that, as we'll talk about in other parts of this segment. You mentioned many of the other guys that Yellow Springs has coming up. Those are going to be painful conversations inside my general manager's office. But I was definitely interested to hear your point of view on Reynaldo Ruiz, because from the outside looking in, I scratch my head at this one quite a bit.
I agree.
Well, Stephen, I think we've pretty much beat the question of how do you give and when do you give and why do you give long-term contracts in our league to a conceivable, reasonable death. Do you have anything else you'd like to talk about before we close this one out and call it a semi-successful first version of Dorks Being Dorks?
I don't. I think we've pretty well beat it up.
Well, that's fantastic. And our next segment, we'll talk a little bit about, I think we've got several options, player options and opt-outs, and when they're good and when they're bad, and at least pretend like we know what we're talking about there.
I can always pretend.
The Brewster Baseball Association is an out-of-the-park baseball league commissioned by Mr. America himself, Matt Rechtenwald, and competed in by an amazing group of outstanding general managers. Check us out at montybrewster.net. You have been listening to Dorks Being Dorks, a podcast where we put BBA GMs together to talk about Out of the Park and how it works in the BBA. Music is Some of My Fears by Daisy May and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license.
I have lost everything. rocks are dead on the rain. The cross is twisted, the stars that will shine. The creation's threatening, the worry is mine. The king was thinking, and now he's dead. John wanted peace, and it's war instead.